Stick on the ice, Jordan.
How about now? Can you hear me now? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to find your seats, please. Ah! That was a bit loud.
I know. I need to adjust it, so you have to turn it back on. So if I can't get it working, oh yeah, no, go up there. That's fine.
I apologize for this. We're working on it. I don't usually use this one. Is it off?
Just use this one. I'm going to turn you on. Use the pink one.
Okay.
It's always so high frequency. I'm good.
I didn't like that microphone anyway. If we can all try to find a seat, we're going to get started in about 3 minutes. I'm not timing you, but about 3 minutes.
I decided to make.
Good afternoon, Airdrie. See, I was supposed to be using the wireless mic, and I'm going to use it later. Good afternoon, Airdrie. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's presentation of Solutions for a New Alberta, brought to you by the Alberta Prosperity Project. We are a group of grassroots Albertans with no politicians at our table, committed to inspiring, advocating, and educating all Albertans on how we can achieve freedom and prosperity through independence. The Alberta Prosperity Project came from humble beginnings in an oilfield shop just over 1 year ago. A group of like-minded individuals had had enough of the ineffectiveness of our provincial government. They had also had enough of the overreach from Ottawa. They decided it was time to take action. So from that humble beginning and often heated debate, the Alberta Prosperity Project was born, and here we are. At this time, I'd like to invite our friend Jackie Hnidey to open our event with a prayer.
Thank you. Well, it's a joy for me to be able to pray for the event today. I know the APP sometimes gets asked the question, why do you guys pray before events? And the reason for that is because the APP recognizes the supremacy of God. So they recognize, yes, beautiful. And that just means that they recognize that God is over all authorities. So it's my privilege to pray for us. So let's just bow our heads. Heavenly Father, we just come before you today, and we thank you, Lord, just for this opportunity that we have to gather together and to listen to some amazing speakers. Thank you, Father, for the weather, for the summer that's coming, Father. We just thank you for your creation. And I thank you, Lord, for every person who is here today. Thank you that they have taken time out of their schedules, God, to come here. And I pray, Father, that you would just bless them and encourage them, Father, with hope. I pray for the speakers today, Father. I ask that you would give them wisdom as they speak and that you would just bless them. And Father, lastly, we just pray for our beautiful province of Alberta, God, from all that you have created, Father. We just thank you that we live here, and we pray, God, that you would just bless this province, that you would just keep us free, God, and that you would bless this movement. And so, God, we just give this entire event to you, and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Jackie. And just to let you know, one of the people who came in said there is a dog outside in the car, and dogs are welcome in this building. So if you want to go get your dog and bring it in, that's fine. Yeah. So my name is Shannon Packham, and I am from Patricia, Alberta. I was a teacher. but I have not been in a classroom since the end of February of 2020. And it was at that time that I realized that if you don't stand up for what is right, then you have to understand that you are also part of what is wrong. I think it's really time that we dig deep and make things right. Thomas Jefferson once said, "Whenever you do a thing, act as if the whole world is watching." The Alberta Prosperity Project has suggestions for our province that will indeed have the whole world watching. Alberta will be able to prove to the world that it is indeed possible to operate and succeed as a sovereign nation, one that will be the envy of every other nation of the world. You're skeptical, I know. That's why we're here. We have an amazing lineup of speakers here today to help you see the possibilities and provide you with the information that you need to help you understand how we can have the success of freedom and prosperity within a new Alberta that is built on integrity and hard work. After these presentations, you'll be able to understand what is waiting for all of us and what we all can have. So this is how the event goes. We have guest speakers. Today we have 4 guest speakers, so we'll have 2, and then we'll have a break, and then we'll have 2 more. And after the 4 speakers have said their piece, we're going to have them all come up onto the stage, and we're going to have a conversation amongst our panelists. There is refreshments at the back of the room. I did have one of the squares. They are quite delicious. And the washrooms are at the back, like where you came in the doors. I have to point out the exits. Obviously, the doors that have exit above them are where you're going to exit if we have a problem. The muster point, I'm told, is by the cenotaph, which is on that side. I must also say that if you're going to exit out these doors, that is a road, so be careful when you're going out there. You leave the building for an emergency and get hit by a car, that's not my problem. When you came in, you passed the membership table, and we count on you buying of memberships. That's how we keep the project rolling. We've been going across the province, and we count on your memberships and things like that to keep the wheels on this bus. We also will pass the bucket a little bit later on in the afternoon, and again, we accept all the donations that you are able to give. Our memberships start at $20, and we also have a $20 student membership for 21 years. Membership table, that's where the petition is, and hopefully Tanner will touch on that a little bit later. I also would like to point out our volunteers that have helped to put this event on today. These are people who believe in freedom and who have been brave enough to take a stand and help their fellow Albertans. And without our volunteers, we wouldn't be here. The other side of fear is courage, and these are a courageous group. Tammy Belanger, Jennifer Clark, and Arnie Bencharski are our chapter leaders for Airdrie. If we give them a hand, please. All right, are you ready to get started? Our first speaker is an independent researcher and a writer. He is a columnist for the Western Standard. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree and a Master of Arts degree in political science from the University of Calgary. He obtained a PhD in political science at the University of Alberta. His book, Alberta, Separatism Then and Now, accounts how federal government policies have been designed to exploit the West, Alberta in particular. You're going to be in the principal's office later. Most recently, he has strongly advocated Alberta independence and boldly thrust this argument forward for an independent Alberta with his published work, No Other Option, Self-Determination for Alberta. He and his wife, Ivy, have 11 children, have been homeschooling them for over 25 years. Ladies and gentlemen, shedding some light on our independence journey, Dr. Michael Wagner.
Thank you for that introduction, Shannon. Okay, so I want to talk to you about why Alberta should become independent. In order to understand why Alberta should become independent, it's really important to understand our history, because Westerners have felt neglected and even exploited by Canada over many years, and so the sentiment has been building over a period of years and getting stronger. So as the feeling of exploitation and neglect builds and builds, more and more Albertans begin to understand why we need to become independent. The US Declaration of Independence uses the phrase, a long train of abuses, to explain why the American colonies had to become independent from Britain. And I would suggest that Alberta has also experienced a long train of abuses from central Canada, and that helps to explain why we should become independent. The West has long felt unfairly treated within Canada. This part of the Prairie West used to be part of what was called Rupert's Land. Rupert's Land was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, and Canada purchased Rupert's Land and annexed it to Canada. There were already people living here at that time. There were thousands of people in the Red River Colony in what is now Manitoba, and they were not consulted about becoming part of Canada. They were just annexed to Canada without being consulted, and some of them had different ideas about what they thought would be best for their political future. So there's been Western discontent right from the very beginning of the West being part of Canada. Then after this became part of Canada, of course, settlers were brought in to create an agricultural economy. And that was good, of course. We have lots of farmers. But the farmers were at certain disadvantages. For one, there was a protective tariff so that the farmers had to purchase their farming equipment from central Canada at higher prices. And when they sold their grain, they had to sell their grain through middlemen, so they lost part of the price to the middlemen, and they also had to pay the transportation costs. So when they bought their equipment, they had to pay more, and when they sold their grain, they got less than they ought to have. And so they were at a disadvantage right from the very beginning. Now, of course, they didn't just sit back and take that. They fought back. And one of the ways Albertans fought back in those days was by turning away from the mainstream parties and creating new parties. So in the 1920s, Alberta had a government by a party called the United Farmers of Alberta. It was the provincial government for the 1920s into the 1930s. And at that time, in the 1920s, the main federal party in Alberta was the Progressive Party. And in those days, the word progressive meant something different than it does today. It's characteristic of this province. It's that spirit of defiance. Push us far enough and we will strike back. That was our record and that is our reputation. So already back in those days, Albertans were fighting back, but they, like as I said, they didn't reach the point yet of thinking that Alberta should become an independent country. Now, the threshold was crossed, though, when Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister. When Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister in the late 1960s, that's when Albertans really began to think about becoming an independent country, at least some of them. Pierre Trudeau, one of the main reasons he got involved in politics was he wanted to make Quebec feel more comfortable within Canada. And so one of the first policies he brought in was the Official Languages Act, which was to give French a stronger presence throughout the whole country, including in the West. But French wasn't, of course, used very much here, and so many Westerners felt that French was being forced down their throats. So the independence came out in 1971. It was called The Unfinished Revolt, Some Views on Western Independence. It was a collection of essays. Now, what's really significant about this is there was two editors who put these essays together, John Barr and Owen Anderson. And John Barr was the executive assistant to Alberta's Minister of Education at that time. And Owen Anderson was the executive assistant to Alberta Premier Harry Strom, the last social credit premier of Alberta. So these are influential people in the government. Now, most of the essays in this book were not favorable towards independence. They mostly favored decentralizing Canada. But there was the one by John Barr did talk about the possibility of Alberta independence. His argument basically was this: we need to try and improve Canada to make it better for Alberta. And if we can't improve Canada that way, then we should look at independence. So this is the first time really in print where we have this argument that let's first try and improve Canada, and then if we can't improve Canada, then we'll become independent. So that was written over 50 years ago. So that idea has been around for that long. Just give Canada another chance before trying to get out. So that's what they were talking about already 50 years ago. Now, the real impetus, though, for the Alberta separatist movement began with events in 1973. There was a Middle East war in 1973, and the price of oil skyrocketed. So here was a chance for Alberta to really cash in on our oil resources. We've been selling oil all these years, but the price of oil had been low. Now it was extremely high, and Alberta would be able to reap the benefits of its resources. But Pierre Trudeau did two things to make sure that Central Canada would benefit more than they ought to have, and Alberta wouldn't benefit it very much as they could have. First of all, the price of Western Canadian oil was kept low within Canada. So the Alberta oil sold within Canada was kept much lower than the world price. So Alberta wouldn't get as much money as they ought to have. Also, Alberta sold oil to the United States, exported oil to the United States. And Pierre Trudeau instituted an export tax on oil, so that Alberta's oil exported to the United States, that much of that money would actually go to the federal government rather than Alberta, which, even though the resources belong to Alberta. So whether the oil was sold within Canada or exported, Alberta was not getting the full benefit of its resources. Of course, this made many Albertans angry, and Premier Peter Lougheed at the time fought very hard against Pierre Trudeau throughout the 1970s to improve the situation so that Alberta could benefit more from its oil resources. There was a federal election in 1979, and Joe Clark was elected. He was the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, and he was from Alberta. It was a minority government, but it was felt that since Joe Clark was from Alberta, that Alberta would finally get a better deal from the federal government. But because it was a minority government, it fell after only a few months, and there was a new federal election campaign in 1980. Now, this 1980 election campaign is very significant. It's what brought Pierre Trudeau back. There was one of the prominent Liberal campaign officials at the time was a guy named Keith Davey, and he summarized the Liberal campaign program as this: screw the West, we'll take the rest. Like historically in Canada, like any big country, like there's different regional interests and there's competition between the regional interests. Normally you expect national leaders to try to smooth over the regional differences in the interest of national unity, to promote national unity. But in this particular federal campaign, instead of emphasizing national unity, Pierre Trudeau decided to exploit the regional differences and campaigned against Alberta. He basically told Central Canada that Alberta is the bad guy and they can re-elect him and he'll put Alberta in its place. So it was a very divisive kind of national election campaign, a kind that we hadn't had before. So of course, Albertans were unhappy when Pierre Trudeau was re-elected in 1980. And then shortly after that, he brought in the National Energy Program, which was basically for the federal government to take over much more control of Alberta's oil industry so that the Central Canada would benefit even more than it had already. But basically, it was a federal government taking control of Alberta's oil industry. Of course, Albertans were very angry, and this is when many people began to contemplate separatism when they never had before. Now, it's very interesting and very significant about 1980, something that Pierre Trudeau did. Well, this National Energy Program and his policies toward Alberta in general turned Albertans against the federal government and made them think about separatism in a way that they never had before. There was a change in Alberta's political culture in 1980. Before 1980, when polling was done on support for independence or separatism, the polling support was generally single-digit support, like 4 or 5 or 6%. After 1980, it's always been double-digit support for independence, sometimes as low as 15 or 16%, but usually more 20 or 25% or higher. So there's a permanent change in Alberta's political culture in 1980 as a result of what Pierre Trudeau did. And so I consider Pierre Trudeau to be the father of the Alberta independence movement because he's the one who created it. Speaking of that, Justin Trudeau likes to talk about a fringe minority. Well, people in Alberta who support Pierre Trudeau, that is a real fringe minority. Anyway, with the rise in separatist support, there was a by-election in 1982 in the Olds Didsbury constituency, and a party called the Western Canada Concept Party elected its candidate. It was the first time a Western separatist had ever been elected in Canada, and so it signified how significant and how deep sentiment in Alberta was for independence at that time. And even though there was that deep, significant sentiment, there were still many people who thought it'd be better to reform Canada. And one of these people was Senator Ernest Manning. Ernest Manning had been premier from he was appointed to the Senate, and he and 3 prominent colleagues in 1981 wrote a book called Regional Representation, the Canadian Partnership. And the argument of their book, again, they were noting how Alberta was alienated from the rest of Canada, and they said there needed to be changes in Canada's national institutions in order to incorporate Alberta's views, in order to give the West a stronger voice within the national institutions. They proposed like a Senate reform so that Western interests could be represented in the national government. And they said that if these reforms of the national institutions were not done, then support for separatism in the West would get stronger and be more likely that the West would separate. But again, it's the idea that we need to reform Canada rather than, in order to prevent separatism from happening. And that was 1981. In 1984, Pierre Trudeau resigned. He was replaced by John Turner. Then there was an election later that year, and Brian Mulroney, the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, was elected. And so we got rid of the Liberal government, and many Albertans felt, okay, we got rid of the Liberals and Trudeau, now things are going to be okay for us. Every member of Parliament from Alberta was part of Mulroney's government, so now we'll be treated fairly. But as it turned out, it didn't really turn out that way. It didn't turn out the way many Westerners felt. In 1986, the federal government had to award a maintenance contract for Canada's new CF-18 fighter jets. The fighter jets had to be maintained by a company that would be specialized, that would specialize in that. And there were two cities that were in competition for getting that maintenance contract: Winnipeg and Montreal. There were companies in each of those cities that could do this work. So the federal government had a specific criteria to determine which of the companies would be best. And based on the federal government's own criteria, the company in Winnipeg would be the best one suited for maintaining the CF-18 contract. So Brian Mulroney awarded the contract to the company in Montreal. Because the Conservative Party, just like the Liberal Party, always faces the same situation, that if they want to get elected, they have to cater to Central Canada. They have to get the votes of Central Canada. So whether it's the Liberals or the Conservatives, they always face the pressure of catering to Central Canada. Of course, the Conservative Party has been better to Alberta historically, and a Conservative government in Ottawa is better than a Liberal government. There's no question about that. But they can't solve Alberta's fundamental problems with the federal government. A Conservative Party government is basically a band-aid solution. It's a temporary solution. Even if someone like Pierre Poilievre became Prime Minister, he could be better for us for a few years, but then he would be gone and be replaced by a Liberal. So the best they can offer us is a temporary reprieve. They can't solve our problem. So that's why I say the Conservative Party of Canada is only a band-aid solution to the problems that we have. Now, because of what happened with the CF-18 contract, a new federal political party was formed, the Reform Party of Canada. Many of you would probably remember that. And their slogan was "The West wants in." They thought that that the national government could be reformed so that Western voices could be heard in the national government. And I have here a photocopy of a pamphlet from 1987, "A New Federal Political Party to Represent the West." This pamphlet is from the Reform Association of Canada, the precursor organization to the Reform Party. This became the Reform Party. But let me just read a couple of sentences from this pamphlet to get a sense of what they were dealing with in 1987, 35 years ago. Throughout our history, Ontario and Quebec have held the lion's share of political influence in Canada, and they continue to dominate the national scene at the expense of the West. That is, Ontario and Quebec continue to dominate the national scene at the expense of the West. Our political and economic from each of the provinces. So something like that would have given Alberta some power within the national institutions so that our interests could be represented in there. Now, in spite of all the support for the Reform Party gradually lost interest in these Western issues. It saw more and more an emphasis on taking national power, so it converted itself into the Canadian Alliance. And then in 2003, it joined with the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada to form the Conservative Party of Canada. And the first leader of the Conservative Party of Canada and the first Conservative Party Prime Minister was Stephen Harper. And many Westerners trusted Stephen Harper because he had been one of the founders of the Reform Party and he was from Calgary. So we knew that he would not be acting against Western Canadian interests. So at that time, there was very little support for Western independence during the Stephen Harper years because we trusted him and we looked up to him. Of course, that all changed in 2015 because Justin Trudeau was elected as the new Liberal Prime Minister. And Justin Trudeau came in with a very different agenda, one that was very harmful to Alberta and to the West. One of the bills that Justin Trudeau's government brought in was Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act, which makes it so much harder to get pipelines approved within Canada. In fact, many people call that the No More Pipelines Bill because essentially it'll make it impossible for more pipelines to be built in Canada. You may have heard about 3 weeks ago or something, the Alberta Court of Appeal ruled that particular the Impact Assessment Act is unconstitutional, but that's just it's just an advisory opinion. It doesn't have any effect. And this issue is going to be decided at the Supreme Court of Canada. And it's more likely that the Supreme Court will actually uphold this law than strike it down. We can't know that for sure now, but it's very likely that the Supreme Court will uphold it. Another bill that Justin Trudeau's government brought in was Bill C-68, the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act, which some people call the Alberta Tanker Ban because it essentially prohibits Alberta oil from being exported off of BC's coast. Now, as a result of these kinds of laws, Alberta is losing control of its natural resources. The Constitution guarantees that the provinces own and control their natural resources, but Justin Trudeau has brought in policies that circumvent the constitutional protections, and so Alberta is increasingly losing control of the natural resources. Of course, the Alberta government challenged Justin Trudeau's carbon tax in the court, and the Supreme Court upheld the carbon tax. It upheld Justin Trudeau's law. One of the dissenting judges, though, in that decision was from Alberta, and he wrote in criticism of the Supreme Court's decision, opens the door to federal intrusion into all areas of provincial jurisdiction. So it's opening the door to even more federal control in areas where the provinces should have their control. In essence, these policies of Justin Trudeau are circumventing the constitutional guarantee of provincial control of natural resources. Now, even as Justin Trudeau tries to shut down our oil industry, the federal government is still reaping billions of dollars from Alberta from the oil industry itself. So they're trying to shut it down and they're getting money from it at the same time. And there's a professor at the University of Calgary, Robert Manzel. He's followed these issues for many, many years. And he calculates that from 1965 to 2018, Alberta has made a net contribution of $630 billion to the federal government. But that's the bad news. Now, I do have good news. Now, the good news is Canada's constitutional law allows for provinces to peacefully separate from Canada. In 1995, you might remember Quebec had an independence referendum which barely failed. And after that referendum, and as a result of that, the federal government sent a reference case to the Supreme Court. That's where they asked the Supreme Court its opinion, on Canada's constitutional law. And the question was, can Quebec unilaterally secede from Canada? Can Quebec unilaterally secede from Canada? And the Supreme Court ruled that no, Quebec cannot unilaterally secede from Canada. However, it did rule that if Quebec was to have a referendum with a clear question and a clear majority voted in favor of independence, then the federal government would have an obligation to negotiate Quebec's independence. Now, this is a case specifically with reference to Quebec, but the constitutional law applies to every province. So this means that for every province in Canada, if they hold a clear question, like if they have a referendum with a clear question on independence and a clear majority of people vote in favor of it, then that federal government has an obligation to negotiate that province's independence. That's kind of the core idea. There's, of course, many other details you can look into, but this is the core idea that you need to understand, that it is constitutional in Canada for a province to hold a referendum and to leave peacefully from Canada according to Canada's constitutional law. There are other countries in the world who have constitutions that without that kind of law. Like you might remember just a few years ago in Catalonia in Spain, that district of Spain voted to separate from Spain, but then the Spanish government arrested the leaders of that movement and Catalonia was not allowed to separate. But that's because Spain's constitution prohibits any part of the country from separating. So their constitution prohibits it. Canada's constitutional law allows it. So just because something happens in one country doesn't mean that applies to Canada. Now, all of this historical information I brought for this particular purpose, and that is to argue that if we look at this history, we realize that Alberta must become independent. I talked about John Barr's article in 1971, already over 50 years ago, saying, first, let's try and reform Canada. Then if we can't reform them, let's become independent. And then in 1981, Ernest Manning and his colleagues said, if we don't reform Canada's national institutions, then it's very likely that the West is going to want to separate. Then in 1988, David Kilgour said, the time has come to rectify these injustices. And even more important was the Reform Party of Canada. We elected all those MPs and we sent them east to fix things, and they weren't able to get it fixed. And it's not any fault of theirs. It's because Canada cannot be fixed. And this is the message of the experience of the Reform Party. Canada's political system cannot be fixed in a way that's beneficial for Alberta. Now, it's important for us to realize we can learn from history, and we must learn from history. John Barr in 1971 could not know that Canada wasn't going to be able to be reformed. And Ernest Manning in 1981, he couldn't know that Canada could not be reformed. Same for, David Kilgour in 1988, and for the Reform Party. Yeah. The point is, these people were all doing good work, and from their historical vantage point, it made sense. What they did made sense back then, and now, 35 years later, we have all this experience that they did not have, and we can look back and see, okay, they tried, they did the best they could, and it didn't work. So ultimately, my point is this. If Preston Manning and the Reform Party could not get a Triple E Senate and otherwise reform Canada's political system, then it can't be done. The West has tried to fix Canada, but it does not want to be fixed. Therefore, the only remaining alternative is for Alberta to get out. If we keep asking Central Canada for a better deal for Alberta, they will just keep laughing at us. They know there's nothing we can do, so they just keep laughing at us. But if we hold a referendum and we vote in favor of independence, they won't be laughing at us anymore. Like even Jason Kenney has tried to do a few things. Jason Kenney challenged the carbon tax at the Supreme Court, but of course the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Justin Trudeau's law. And Jason Kenney held the referendum on equalization. And where did that get us? Nothing. We've been trying and trying and trying, and none of these things work. And so Alberta needs to rekindle that spirit of independence, or that spirit of defiance that Ted Byfield talked about, and become an independent country. Thank you. Thanks.
We got new batteries in all these, and we should be good to go now. Just wanted to point out Michael's books. No Other Options, Self-Determination for Alberta, and Alberta, Separatism Then and Now. He has them on the back table for $15 each. Okay, our next presentation. Our next presenter is from Lloydminster, Alberta. He's a brilliant industrial organization economist and a published author. He is a speaker and a commentator on political and ethical issues and has studied under some of Canada's foremost economists. With his keen interest, wit, and bright mind, he offers so much perspective to the Alberta Prosperity Project, and he's here to demonstrate the many merits and benefits of a free and prosperous Alberta. He is also co-hosting weekly podcasts in his efforts to spread the Alberta Prosperity Project message for a free and prosperous Alberta far and wide. He is also the VP of Economics. He cares deeply about the state that Alberta finds herself in and about how intrusively our governments meddle in our economy in order to facilitate our ruin. He is here today to share with us Alberta's prosperity and freedom through independence. And an economic forecast. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Tanner Hnidey.
works. It works. Oh, it works. First, please allow me to express on behalf of my colleagues as here as well, just my sheer thankfulness and gratitude at seeing all of you here today. All of us are so captivated by the size and solidarity of this movement, which has expanded in such a short amount of time. And meeting everyone here today is such a healthy encouragement for all of our souls. Now, normally, Dr. Dennis Modry, our CEO, performs his speech regarding the reasons and the steps towards an independent Alberta. And then I come up and talk about the economics. But Dr. Modry is indisposed today, and so I have been given the privilege of performing his talk about the topics of his speech. So to the point. Tyrannies come very suddenly. You do not realize a tiger has been stalking you until it has pounced. We find ourselves floating down this river with great anxiety about what is lurking in the jungle on our flank. And we're increasingly nervous about approaching these crushing falls of Laurentian socialism in Canada and, of course, the Great Reset. And even if a man has reservations or clues that he's being stalked by a tiger, as I would argue all of us do here today, evidenced by the fact that we are here and are privileged to know, it's almost impossible to tell exactly where that tiger is. Most of our leaders in Canada, not all, but most, appear to be mere puppets for even more puppets who simply occupy a higher position in the apparatus of a modern and globalist neo-Marxist order. So in this, the APP defers to the wisdom of a man named G.K. Chesterton and believes it is, quote, essential to resist a tyranny before the tyranny exists. Or in our case, exists more terribly than it already does and threatens to be. So we must defend ourselves against the tiger before the tiger even knows you're in its proximity. Now, some say we're being hyperbolic. We are not. And we know we're not being hyperbolic because we have all read with disdain the public plans of the WHO and the WEF and other NWO organizations allied with Canada and Canada's government. And we have watched our industrious and beloved province descending this derrick of prosperity and drawing ever lower into an abyss of economic and social despair because, again, of the rules and regulations from Ottawa. We are presently consumed, for example, with this monstrous WHO and treaty that will be, make no mistake, adopted by Canada, and that's presently being discussed. Here is a quote about it from some prominent commentators in Europe, doctors and researchers, et cetera, on the treaty. They say, for this treaty to have teeth, the organization that governs it, the WHO, needs to have the power, either political or legal, to enforce compliance. To move with the treaty, WHO, therefore, needs to be empowered financially and politically. If international pandemic response is enhanced, compliance is enhanced. And this is happening right now. This is happening in Canada. We do not have decades, right? This tiger, so to say, is clawing at our door. And we're also appalled, of course, to hear about critical race theory that's being taught in our schools. If we present arguments of logic and fact, we are cruelly labeled racists. And if we so much as voice our opinion in opposition to a socialist tyranny, we are slandered as hateful, intolerant, ignorant primates. And neither can we neglect to address the economic situation of this precarious position that we're in. Taxes, equalization, hundreds of billions transferred to Ottawa in a decade, let alone across the decades. Tens of billions transferred and never returned every year. And I might make a quick note. So we read a report that says, let's say Alberta has transferred $600 billion over the span of decades. That's true to a point, but you must remember, you must take into account the reality of what's known as opportunity cost. So what could we have done with that $600 billion instead of giving it to Ottawa? Well, we could have invested it. We could have put it towards infrastructure. We could have put it towards tax reform, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that was foregone because instead it went to Ottawa. And so in reality, the number, 600 billion, or whatever number you want to use, is much higher than what is explicitly stated. Of course, there's also malnourished pipeline capacity, a lack of energy innovation, and regulatory holdup. All of this protrudes from the federal government into Alberta. So why have we been powerless to do anything about it? That's the question. So I've been very recently studying the Greeks and the Romans and the history of antiquity, just for fun. And a while ago, I discovered a man, a Greek mathematician named Archimedes. Perhaps you've heard of him. Here's what Archimedes said, or one of his famous quotes. Archimedes said, "Give me a lever long enough, and I shall move the world." Archimedes understood what our politicians in Ottawa understand, but apparently what many of our politicians in Alberta do not. Archimedes understood the principles of leverage. So out of university, government shutdowns were abounding, and so jobs were scarce. But I was blessed insofar as I, out of high school, obtained my Class 1, just as a backup. I thought it might be good to get, and indeed it did come in handy. And so for a little while, I hauled grain. For my dad grew up on the farm, my mom grew up on the farm. I've always loved machines and so on, and figured I'll pull some Super Bs for a bit and make some cash. Not a whole lot of cash, but a little bit. And like every farmer, I would overload that semi in the morning a lot, and then you'd hammer on it to get to the elevator really fast before the cops could catch you. But as you're doing that, you began to think, or I began to think. I'd say, how is it possible that this vehicle, weighing about 120,000 pounds, if you're legal, how is it able that it can pull so much weight? How is it possible that it can stop and start and roll down the highway and slow down at a moment's notice, if necessary? The semi is able to maneuver such remarkable scales of mass because of a combination of levers that rotate as the engineers design. Now, we call these levers gears, and they compose a large part of the semi's transmission, and they provide the semi with leverage. Without those gears, without those levers, try as you might, push as you might, strain as you might, do whatever you want, do whatever you will eventually surrender to the reality that without the gears, you cannot force that loaded semi to move. This reality of leverage holds true for Albertans as well, and Alberta as a whole. We have tried to navigate our fortunes in Confederation for 116 years, literally, to no avail. Premiers have been elected and dismissed. Politicians have promised everything, and they have delivered nothing. We have not been able to address and change the problems of Confederation because, as Dr. Wagner has already so eloquently stated, we have never had leverage, and we presently have no leverage. So it's at about this time that Dr. Modry likes to poll the audience when he does his speech, and so I'll do the same. And don't be shy. There's no right or wrong answer here, just for information. So if you'd like, please raise your hand if you'd prefer that Alberta try to fix its circumstances within the Confederation. Okay, and how many here would prefer that Alberta, again, as Dr. Modry states, how many would prefer that Alberta simply got out of Dodge and became an independent nation and a sovereign constitutional republic? Usually the split we see is about 90-10 or 80-20. So in any case, let me explain to you, to hammer the point, why it's impossible to alter the Constitution in Confederation. Let's use equalization as an example, because I'm an economist. Now, the formula of equalization is not constitutionally enshrined, but the institution of equalization is. So the Constitution doesn't say, here's how you divvy up equalization, but it does say you have to have it. And to be totally honest, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems to me to be legally absurd, actually, because equalization employs federal revenues in order to fund expenditure in provincial jurisdiction, which therefore falls outside of the prerogative and scope of the federal parliament. But nonetheless, can we end equalization? Can we end the equalization program? Is it possible? What is required in order to alter the Constitution? 1, you need a majority vote in the House of Commons. It's a tough start. 2, we need a majority vote in the Senate. 3, you need 7 out of 10 provinces representing 50% of the population voting in favor to alter the Constitution. So ending equalization in this case. That means you have to have at least Ontario or Quebec to vote in your favor. Of course, you have to navigate the fact that Quebec can exercise this veto, this regional veto, so to say. And then 5, how will the Supreme Court adjudicate constitutional affairs, considering you have 7 judges appointed from the East and 2 from the West? In fact, amending the Constitution is so difficult, ending equalization and other egregious law is so difficult, that the professor of world constitutions and director of constitutional studies in Harvard, at the University of Texas, graduate of Yale, Harvard, and Oxford, his name is Richard Albert, in his paper, The Difficulty of Constitutional Amendment in Canada, says, quote, major constitutional amendment to the Constitution of Canada may today be so difficult as to render it impossible. And even if we really want to scratch salt into the wound, we might disclose that in the province of PEI, for example, 1 MP in the House of Commons is elected for every 41,000 individuals. Whereas in Alberta, 1 MP in the House of Commons is elected for every 120,000 individuals. In this, the facts regarding the structure of Confederation and the Constitution clearly and presently conclude that Alberta needs to change. We need a change. This decision is not conceived out of malice or spite, but rather objective necessity. But again, I ask, what is the leverage? For that matter, what is the horsepower, the torque, the substance, the engine of this movement? Well, you will find the substance at our website, abprosperity.com. There you can read our documents, research, FAQs, etc., proposed policies and governance, and more. But let me just give you a brief appetizer of what we are proposing. The first and most fundamental, foundational policy that we are advocating for is for Alberta to become a sovereign constitutional republic that is grounded in the unchangeable and incorruptible supremacy of God. We are also advocating that Alberta introduce the most robust recall legislation so that if a politician is not doing what he or she was elected to do and is brazenly violating the Constitution and its precepts, the Alberta Constitution and its precepts, we as individuals and constituents have both the right and the opportunity and the legal ability to remove that politician from office. Of course, we're also proposing healthcare reform. an independent regulatory board for energy projects, slashing current income tax rates to a flat, fair 10% rate, and that's a good one. I like that one as an economist. And introducing a stable and hard independent currency, whether through currency competition, gold standard, or by some other means, in order to totally and finally extirpate this hydra of inflation and the federal monopoly on the money supply. Perhaps we'll call Alberta's new dollar Ralph bucks. I like that one. I like Ralph bucks. That'd be great. Proposed policies like this are the horsepower and the engine of the movement. Again, they are all available on our website and are available in much more comprehensive detail. But again, I ask, what is the leverage? What are the gears, the transmission behind this movement? What is the leverage to get all of this going? The leverage is a successful legal referendum on Alberta's independence, and it grants us the legal and moral legitimacy to free ourselves once for all time from Ottawa's violation of the Constitution, destruction of our currency, and alliance with this Marxist, globalist, omnicompetent world order. So, how do we do it? On our website, you'll find, under the FAQ section, a question about this, and it's titled, "What is the timeline to get control of our destiny?" But let me give you, again, a brief overview. Step 1, educate as many Albertans as possible on the benefits and merits of independence. Of course, there are still many who don't know about it. Step 2, plant, nurture, and grow the APP's membership to such a capacity that we compose at least 3.5% of the voting population. Now, I say 3.5% because if you've ever listened to Dr. Modry, you'll know that there was a recent study concluded by a Dr. Erica Chenoweth out of Harvard University. And again, the conclusion of that study was that 3.5% of a relevant population, in the case of elections, the voting population, 3.5% actively involved in a movement will dictate the direction of society. Of course, this is peaceful, right? So we need this 3.5%. Now, step 3, we mobilize those numbers. Hundreds of thousands of members, which is well beyond the 3.5% required, and exercise our presence as individuals and as a community. The purpose of growing the membership to such fantastic capacity, or such a fantastic capacity, is so the self-interested politician will understand that in order to be elected in Alberta, he or she will have to adopt and support the policies of the APP. They, to quote Klein, will need to find a parade and get in front of it, and the APP is that parade. Ah, you say. But what if the will of the people is no longer my own? What if, through vigorous, vicious propaganda, the will of the people is led astray and they are persuaded to support, for example, locking my business down? So the question is welcome. The answer is, this is precisely the reason that we are proposing Alberta become a sovereign constitutional republic. You see, the republic binds the politician and the citizen to law, to objective law, so that individual rights and freedoms are protected above societal ones in order to receive the greatest measure of both. You see, the reverse doesn't hold. Now, step 4. With said numbers, elect a government in 2023 with a mandate to hold an honest referendum on independence. Now, let me take an opportunity, or this opportunity, to make a clarification. We're often asked if the APP is a party. It's not. We're often asked if the APP is going to be a party. Again, it is not. We are an independent educational project with the sole mandate of educating as many Albertans as possible on the benefits and merits of independence. Our nonprofit status means that we are freed from political regulation and rules and so on, and enables us to deploy in a more expansive wave than otherwise would be possible. So we are the education that convinces Albertans of the benefits and merits of independence, and then a separate independent party will run in the election. That's the vehicle to achieve that independence. Now, step 5. Post-successful election, so once an independence government has been elected in 2023, implement an Alberta Sovereignty Act to assume control of policing and pensions, employment insurance, immigration, etc., tax collection, and so on, which would thereby set the stage for a referendum on independence. And finally, you hold that referendum on independence as soon as is logistically possible. Once that successful referendum is passed, negotiate with the federal government for a period of months, and if they refuse to capitulate to our demands, then unilaterally, unequivocally, absolutely declare our independence from the Confederation of Canada, declare Alberta a sovereign constitutional republic, and declare our transition to a free and prosperous nation. To the final question, how can you get involved and help us achieve this wonderful, hopeful objective? Firstly, please consider purchasing a membership with the APP. Our membership numbers are the legitimate proof that MLAs require in order to understand the massive scope and support of this movement. The more members we have, the less able MLAs are, and MPs for that matter, to dismiss the influence of this project. As well, we invite you to become a member, to become part of our community, to receive updates, news, articles, research, and so on, etc. All of us were forced into isolation and left alone for 2 years, but no more. No more of that. The connections and new friends that we've made, even in just these last few months that we've been traveling around the province, have been just phenomenal. Thirdly, please consider creating a chapter or becoming involved in a chapter in your area. We need them in Calgary and in Airdrie and the surrounding area, of course. Shannon, I'm sure she'll speak more to this later. She's one of the resident experts on it. But invite your friends, have a coffee, have a chat, live like normal human beings, so to say, and speak about these benefits and merits to independence. Now, finally, some say that by pursuing independence, we are abandoning Canada, but we're not. We're trying to save it. And it's been appointed to we as Albertans to lead the way. Through socialism, Ottawa is stealing our capacity to generate wealth, but then they demand equalization and enterprise. They tell us we are free while seizing our bank accounts and assets for supporting a convoy, but we cannot go on tolerating this treatment any longer. So that's why we formed the APP, and that's why we're asking you to join. A world where we no longer own our rights and freedoms, individual rights and freedoms, our property is one where government does. But a world where government owns our property is a socialist world, and a socialist world is an intolerable world, which is why, through the work of the APP, it is the one we intend to avoid, and a free and prosperous Alberta is the one we intend to protect and uphold. Thank you.
Okay, before I give you guys a recess here, I'm going to introduce the people that make this project possible. Our VP Internal Affairs is Mr. Will Stair. Our VP Economics is Tanner Hnidey. Walter Harris DeMeo is the VP Communications. Alain Gauthier is the VP Technology. I don't see Rob. Oh, there's Rob. Rob Patterson is our CFO. Jeff Rath is the VP Legal Affairs. Pam Lair is our Events Coordinator. I'm the Education Coordinator. My name is Shannon Packham. Pam Koenig coordinates all of our volunteers. And they didn't put these two guys on there, so they're on my hand. Hunter Hnidey is the VP of Marketing, and Jason Lemieux is our merchandiser. Without these guys, we wouldn't be at all these places every different weekend. Let's take a break, and that gives you a chance to talk to these people. And
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
and then I was like, did it quit again?
1, 2, 3. Okay, well, Walter is also gone again, so I'm going to go to.
So are we, so like, this one's tinny, you hear it? How do we fix that? It's tinny, can you hear it? It's right here. Echo, echo, echo. It's a squeal. I can hear the squeal. Is it on? Test, test, sound test. Can you hear me at the back of the room? No. But I don't know why. Is it tinny? You hear that? Echo? Echo right there? But do you hear like the squeal?
Right now?
Because typically, the high and the low, right? You don't want too much low.
So
Or high. Like bring a high pass filter on that mixer that you want, and then turn those on. So it cuts it at 80 hertz or 80, yeah, hertz. 80, I think 80 kilohertz, the highest one. I think it might be. I think maybe back a little bit.
okay.
Like maybe a foot back out.
So should I try all of them?
Just like this one and this one.
I'm gonna put one somewhere.
It's good enough.
Try it now.
Yeah, keep it. Just keep it.
Sound check. Sound check. Sound check. Sound check. Can you hear me at the back of the room? Yes, thank you. What about this one? Can you hear this one? Perfect.
This one works good. Yeah. Can you hear me in the back there? Yeah. Okay, I can speak louder. That's not a problem. Yeah.
I'll use it. We're not asking questions. She just has a question.
So I set the timer if you care.
They won't turn the mics are off. I'm going. Ladies and gentlemen, can we find a way back to our seats, please?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I didn't know if you wanted to. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started. Let's find our way back to our seats, please. Okay, we're going to get started. Here we go. I need somebody that can whistle. Louder. Do that louder. Whistle in this microphone. Okay, we still have some stragglers, but we got to move on. Hopefully, our next guest is still in the room. Our next guest is a civil litigation lawyer and former MLA. He is a political commentator and has served as Alberta's Public Accounts Committee Chair, Assistant Solicitor General, Official Opposition House Leader, and member of the Treasury Board. He is a hockey dad and an avid hiker. He is here this afternoon to discuss the Free Alberta strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Rob Anderson. There we go. This one will work.
There you go. Hi, everyone. How's it going? Excellent. What a crowd. I just love these types of events because, hope I'm not getting, if feedback, you'll let me know. Because I feel like I'm among some of the most patriotic Albertans and Canadians in this country. And I really feel that way. I feel that the things that we're fighting for, things that you're fighting for right now and discussing, they're not only the key to saving our province, but they're also the key to saving our country, as Tanner was saying earlier. And I want to get into that. I want to explain a little bit about that. For those of you who don't know me, thanks for the introduction. I really enjoyed those speeches, by the way, Tanner and Michael. Let's give them a hand. Those are fantastic. That Tanner speech, I tell you, that was you've got a future in politics, my friend. That's I could see you up there in the legislature, the parliament, hammering away on some stuff. We're getting some feedback here, aren't we? Yeah, a little bit. No? Okay, I'll try. I don't know where it's coming from, but I'm also in my part-time when I'm not practicing law, or not being a I got 4 teenage boys right now, and they all play hockey, and it's a busy time. But when I'm not practicing law or coaching or doing something like that, I've been the executive director of the Free Alberta Strategy. And who in here has heard of the Free Alberta Strategy? Incidentally, I just said, okay, quite a bit of you. Awesome, that's fantastic. How it came about is I, like many of you, have become increasingly frustrated with the direction of the province on the federal provincial issue. We have tried everything. I mean, we don't have to go through that because Michael, I think, covered that very well. But I mean, we have made protest parties. We've moved. We've sent people to government. We've elected separatist MLAs here. We've started protest parties within the province. Parties federally. I mean, we've bought billboards. We have trade offices. We've written a lot of very terse, angry letters, and frankly, we've been scoffed at over and over and over again. And the difference now is that I think it's gotten to the point now whereas before Alberta was being attacked from a perspective of sucking its wealth out, $650 billion over the period of equalization. 630 is another number, and as Tanner said, if you extrapolate the opportunity cost from that, it's far in excess of $1 trillion. But that used to be what all Ottawa wanted. They wanted the eggs from the golden goose, right? The golden eggs. But now it's changed a bit. Now it's changed a lot. Alberta is now facing existential crisis. And that is because the new Trudeau, or the old Trudeau, if you look at Pierre Trudeau, he just wanted to control the oil and gas industry, wanted to suck as much wealth as possible. But Pierre never wanted to, no one's a fan of him in here. Any fans of Pierre Trudeau in here? No one's a fan of him. But his purpose of the National Energy Program was not to destroy the oil and gas sector. It was essentially to control it, to take it over federally. And it had some very poor unintended consequences for that, but that's what happens when socialists bring in bad policy. But the difference is his son, our national drama teacher and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, his entire focus is to destroy and to eliminate Alberta's primary and Canada's primary industry, that being the energy industry. That is his stated goal. This is not some kind of conspiracy theory. Justin Trudeau is he's not just a card-carrying member of the Great Reset. He is I would say, a very high-ranking member of that group. That is his religion. That is his God. And that's what he serves. And part of the doctrine that they espouse, of course, is the end of fossil fuel use and, of course, mass redistribution of wealth from those countries and provinces that have strong economies to those that are generally either dysfunctional or led by socialist and communist leaders. That's the goal of the Great Reset. That's what they do. So when he looks at Alberta, he sees an impediment to that. He sees that we're standing in his way of achieving that goal for Canada as he tries to virtue signal to the UN and to others who he wants to. That's his kind of post-PM career path that he's looking at there. So that's what we're dealing with. We're not dealing with someone wanting to take control of our industry. We're dealing with a human being that wants to destroy our greatest industry, and when we say industry, that's, some people think that's a dirty word, but what does that mean? That means jobs. That's food on the table. That's bringing your kids to sports. That's taking them, camping. That's making sure they have a proper education and a university that teaches applicable education to them. It means a lot of things. It means your retirements, so you don't have to work to the bone until you're 75, 80, 85 or beyond. That's what industry means. It's not a dirty word. It's the key to prosperity. And clean, cheap, affordable, I would say, dependable energy is the key to lifting the world out of poverty, and it's the key to having a first world prosperous economy and people. And we need to realize that Alberta has this, and we can give this to not just ourselves, but to the world. So how did the Free Alberta strategy come about? We were obviously very frustrated. We're seeing this prime minister receive another minority government, despite not even having the most votes. You know, surprise, surprise. And we were tired. We didn't want to. We were tired of the solutions where, looking at this, the proposed solutions, which were generally about fixing Ottawa. Like, to me, Ottawa is not fixable. Like, Ottawa is corrupt. It's completely broken. It is completely dysfunctional. We've sent really good men and women there from Alberta, and they haven't been able to do essentially jack squat. And it's not that they're, oh, hold it up. Sorry, I'll hold it up a little bit more. They haven't been able to do anything. It's not because they're bad people. Stephen Harper's not a bad person, but the constant drive, as Michael was referring to always try to win national power means you have to give to Toronto, to Montreal, to the Maritimes and so forth. And you have to do so in a very socialistic way that does not benefit the West, the free market, or individual and economic freedom. So that's the problem that we face there. So we put our heads together. When I say we, it's quite a few of us, but the main folks were Barry Cooper. Many of you probably have read at the University of Calgary. Myself, Derek Frum was a constitutional scholar. He's been very active on the COVID file. We've worked together on several files to try to protect people's rights who do not want to comply with the vaccine mandates and so forth. Anyway, really smart guy. And we said, look, what are some things we can do here in Alberta right now without having to ask permission from Ottawa to do? To take our autonomy back, to take our sovereignty back as a province without having to convince the East that we need a constitutional amendment, or without having to elect another protest party take 20, 30 more years to do that, because we don't have 20 or 30 more years. This has to be fixed now. This had to be fixed 10 years ago, but we can't wait to do some of the great ideas that were spoken of today. A lot of these things are 10, 15, 20-year projects to get an entire province on board with some of this. What can we do today, though? And that's what the Free Alberta strategy is all about. It's about a set of reforms that the provincial government can implement today, right now, to ensure that Alberta is sovereign and in control of its own affairs, sovereign within Canada still, but sovereign, almost a nation within a nation, as our friends in Quebec would like to say. And it shouldn't be controversial. I mean, obviously, we heard Scott Moe talk about this concept very recently, saying Saskatchewan should consider this, saying that they should have the same rights as Quebec does. I mean, Quebec is a nation within a nation. They have been, you can agree whether that's good or bad or you're indifferent, but they are. They've been recognized as such by the Parliament. They have a National Assembly. Their Constitution says it. So the question for Albertans is, well, what are we doing? Right? 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, we've been waiting 106 years or 12. How old are we now? I think how old are we now? 116 years. And we say, oh, well, people, we haven't done anything. We've been sitting on our hands for 116 years. Meanwhile, Quebec, they've been doing stuff. And and to the point where they're dictating terms now, right? We need to do the same. We need to learn some of those lessons, and not so much from their socialist leanings, but from their clarity with regards to how they protect their sovereignty. Like take a look at the Emergencies Act, that treachery that was the Prime Minister's invocation of the Emergencies Act during the protest in Ottawa. Just disgusting. Freezing people's bank accounts without due process of law, forcing tow truck companies to enforce their seizure of personal property. These were not dangers or terrorists to the country. Everyone knows that. These were protesters. The Prime Minister was trying to attack and jail his enemies, his political enemies. That's what happens in third world nations. That's what happens in nations without rule of law. That's what happens in Russia. That's where that happens. Well, it happened here for a little bit anyway. And what did Quebec do? What was Quebec's response? Does anybody know that? It's funny because Quebec was in agreement that the trucker protest was awful, and of course they were all big on the old vaccine mandates and all that garbage. But still, Quebec immediately recognized the danger of allowing Ottawa to control police enforcement in their boundaries, within their boundaries. So what do? The next day, passed a motion immediately saying that Quebec will not enforce the Emergencies Act will not be enforced in the province of Quebec. Immediately, even though they agreed with what essentially was the outcome of that, they will not cede their sovereignty to Ottawa in that way. What did Alberta do? Nothing. Said, we don't need that. Jason Kenney running around, we don't need that. We can handle it ourselves. So thanks, Jason. We'll actually do something about it. How about that? Right? So that's what the Free Alberta strategy is about. What is our mission? And we're not a political party either, by the way. We're much like the APP, which is why we're so excited to work with them, because we think even though the APP has some I would say some short-term, long-term, and medium-term objectives, so autonomy, independence, and so forth, we're a little different. We're advocating that Alberta stay within Canada, if at all possible, but to do so on our terms as a sovereign nation within a nation, with a sovereign jurisdiction within Canada. And we want to make sure that we, as part of that, we end the equalization as we know it, the equalization structure as we know it, and then of course open up Alberta so that we can export our resources and our wares, our products all over the world without any interference from the federal government. Yeah. So the corner piece of the Free Alberta strategy is something called the Alberta Sovereignty Act. I'm going to say that there's a lot of things in the Free Alberta strategy that you'll recognize that have been talked about before, and you've probably read papers on it. We need our own provincial police force. We need our own pension plan. We need to collect our own taxes. We need to, you can go down the list. There's several things in there that we talk about that you've heard of that were in the firewall letter that you're probably familiar with from 2001. But the Alberta Sovereignty Act is different. The Alberta Sovereignty Act essentially think about it as a notwithstanding clause for provincial jurisdictional issues. Okay, so what it does is the Alberta government would essentially pass the Alberta Sovereignty Act in the legislature. And what it could do then is that it could invoke that act under the authority of that act. It would refuse enforcement of any federal law, any federal court decision or regulation of any kind, policy, that interfered in Alberta's provincial jurisdictional rights that are enshrined in the Canadian Constitution, or that the legislature feels is an undue attack on the interests of Albertans. So in other words, you can, whatever that federal law is, whatever that Supreme Court decision is that is put out there, the provincial government would say, under the authority of the Alberta Sovereignty Act, this particular law here that the feds have passed, we will not enforce that within the boundaries of the province of Alberta. So notwithstanding your federal law, we're not going to enforce it here. There was talk about, people naturally say, well, how do you do that? So what are examples of that? Of course, the Emergencies Act, that'd be an example. We're not going to enforce that here. We could invoke the Alberta Sovereignty Act to not enforce that. The carbon tax, another example. Emissions caps, another example. There's going to be almost certainly, from what I'm hearing with some of my friends in Ottawa, there's going to be an excess profit tax that's going to be imposed upon our energy industry probably here in the next couple of years under the NDP Liberal Coalition, which is going to, of course, scare capital and jobs and all the other bad things that will happen to our industry on that. Well, we have the Alberta Sovereignty Act. We're not going to enforce that here. Okay? So it's a very important piece. And people say, well, how can you do that? Well, the reason we can do it is because Alberta, there was talk about leverage earlier, the gears as Tanner was talking about the gears in the fully loaded semi-truck, right? And the leverage is that Alberta is essentially, we enforce all the laws, both federal and provincial, within the province of Alberta. We control most of the enforcement mechanisms. So if you have a federal law, You still have to enforce that law. And who enforces the law? Well, if it's on the person, your police force, right? The police force enforces the law. Well, if it's against property, it's your land title system. If it's against personal property, you got the Civil Enforcement Act. That's all provincial, right? If you want to garnish someone's wages because they won't pay their bills, well, that's all under the Civil Enforcement Act. Our courts, people think the courts are federally controlled. Not true. The judges in the courts are federally appointed, but the actual court system, the actual clerk of the court, the actual mechanisms, the wheels that actually go out and enforce orders and so forth, that whole apparatus is entirely provincial. Okay? So if you have a law from the federal government that, for example, says you have to charge a carbon tax, but as a province, we decide that we are not going to enforce anybody to collect or pay the carbon tax within the province. What is the federal government going to do about that? What can they do? The answer is really they can't do anything. Well, they can they'll get a court injunction. Okay, well, under the Alberta Sovereignty Act, we won't enforce that. Okay, we'll get the police to arrest them, put a stop work order on that site that just started that oil project that wasn't approved by the federal government. Okay, well, we have our provincial police force isn't going to enforce that stop work order, so fill your boots. What are you going to do? This is not a crazy idea. People say, well, that's crazy. How does that work? Quebec's been doing this for decades. Do you think that their ban, they have a pipeline ban right across Quebec. You can't, the reason Energy East doesn't work is because, or was shut down essentially, is because Quebec wouldn't play ball. And they passed a law in their National Assembly to ban that pipeline from going through. Now, is that constitutional? The answer is no, it's not. It's totally unconstitutional. The Supreme Court, if it was challenged by Ottawa, which of course it wouldn't be, because that would be politically unwise for them. If they did, the Supreme Court would have to say that that's unconstitutional. There's no doubt Quebec can't stop a national pipeline any more than it can a national road system or a national railway, right? But they do it anyway. And the reason they do it anyway is because they call the feds bluff every time. Same with the Emergencies Act. When they pass that, they say, well, we don't really care. Notwithstanding that, we're just not going to enforce it in Quebec. So you can pass whatever you want, but this one we're not enforcing. And the feds are running into that at the Languages Act and all the things. And it's not, and don't get caught up in I don't agree with the way Quebec, runs their province or their Languages Act stuff. That's just awful. Don't get caught up in that. Just look at what they do. Look at the method that they're employing. That's what I'm saying we need to look at and copy. It's their fierce protection of their sovereignty. Fierce protection. That Quebec way of doing things, we need to take that here in Alberta. We need to do that here. So that's the Alberta Sovereignty Act. It should be Bill 1 of, I hope, the next leader, frankly, of the UCP, that's their Bill 1. And what the Free Alberta strategy is going to do, certainly over the next 6 months, is do everything in our power one way or another. It's still very open-ended in that regard, but to make sure that Bill 1 of the next Premier of Alberta is the Alberta Sovereignty Act. So that's what we're going to be working on over the next 6 months. I want to talk to you a little bit about, there's also the Equalization Termination Act, but you know what? There's so much in there that you're already aware of that I don't really want to go. It's the getting our own pension plan, collecting our own taxes. You can go down the line, check out the Free Alberta Strategy. It's online on the freealbertastrategy.com website. It goes into the kind of the deep doctrine, so to speak, on all that and how we would work that. But we have to end equalization. You all know that. I don't need to talk about that at length, so I'm going to skip over that part. I want to invite you to do something before I close here. I want you to think about, in my view, this next 6 months is quite possibly the most important 6 months in this province's history. And I'm going to tell you why. I know that's quite a claim, but I really do believe that, because I believe that a lot of people, including many in this room, spent a lot of time and effort getting this current federal lost premier out of his throne. And we were, thanks to all of us, we're successful in doing so barely. But we have now, we have to turn that into something now. There's an opportunity now. And it's an interesting opportunity because the population has, they've seen what's happened with the erosion of their freedoms during the COVID crisis. They're not happy about it. The pendulum's swinging back on that issue, and they're like, this is, what happened there was dangerous. It's dangerous to our kids. It was dangerous to our freedoms. People are, not just in rural Alberta, many in the cities as well, are starting to realize just how dangerous this is and what was perpetrated on them. The autonomy issue, the issue we've just been talking about right now, Alberta's place in Confederation, is also very much top of mind because we've seen the danger of the Emergencies Act like right in front of our faces, how tyranny can so quickly just immediately take away our rights of free speech, rule of law, all of those things, just with the stroke of a pen by some tyrant prime minister in Ottawa. It's scary stuff. So people are thinking about this right now. And they see what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, and they see, you know, the stupidity of the world's decision to rely on third world dictatorships for their energy needs instead of a prosperous democratic economy like Alberta, a place like Alberta. They're seeing all this. If we get involved in this UCP leadership, meaning if we buy our memberships in the UCP race and we vote for a candidate that absolutely agrees that Bill 1 is going to be the Alberta Sovereignty Act, and they agree with our own pension plan, police force, and not just agree with it, but that is the agenda that they will enact in October on day one after this race is complete. How do we not seize that? How do we not seize that opportunity, honestly? Have we had that opportunity before? Has a credible mainstream candidate been running for the UCP or the PCs or anyone before them with essentially not a separatist agenda, but certainly, I would say, certainly a sovereignty agenda? I'm challenging each of you over the next 6 months, over the next 4 months probably actually, to follow that race closely. And if no candidate steps forward, if it's all a bunch of milquetoast and BS and no one's talking about it and it's, oh, we can't offend the woke left or wrap ourselves in the national flag, Ottawa's not broken, we would never declare ourselves sovereign. If that's all you get from your candidates, then I agree with you, just whatever. But take a look. And if those candidates do come forward here in the next, you'll probably know within the next 3 or 4 weeks, I challenge you to seize this opportunity because it's unlike any we may ever have again, certainly within the next 4 or 5 years. Because as much as I agree with the sentiments and the frustration that makes us want to just, you know, leave this country, because I get it. It is what we wouldn't join this country right now if under this deal. That's for sure. So I fully understand it and I'm with you on that. But I also know that the majority of Albertans, if you do talk to them, and if you really, polling does bear this out, but also just in your regular conversations with your friends and neighbors, most Albertans are in a place where they know we're getting hosed by Ottawa. They understand the danger that Ottawa presents. They really do. But they want us to see if we can find a way to take back our self-governance, our sovereignty without having to leave the country. And I know that's not the majority of this room, but I think if you're honest with yourselves, you know it's the majority of your neighbors. And this is an opportunity to talk to them, to get them on board with moving our province more and more to be the nation within a nation that we should be. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Rob Anderson. Our next guest is from Calgary. He's been practicing law for more than 30 years. He has effectively advocated for the rights and interests of the First Nations in Canada at all levels of court for over 30 years. of Mikisew in what has become a landmark decision of that court. You might also recognize his name as one of the litigators who has had Hinshaw on the hot seat over the last little while. He is a no-nonsense, let's get results kind of guy, and we are happy to have him on our board of directors as the VP General Counsel. Ladies and gentlemen, here to shed some light on independence and the legal system is Mr. Jeff Rath.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's so nice to be speaking at one of these events so close to home, as opposed to Athabasca or lots of the other places we've been running around the province in. So it's nice to talk to friends and neighbors. So thank you for the welcome and pleasure to see so many of you out. Thank you. And I'd also like to thank all of the previous speakers, and I'd like to thank Rob for his remarks, and I'd like to thank him for all the work that went into the Free Alberta strategy. But I guess my question for the room and my question for Rob is that strategy seems to be very predicated on the Alberta legislature being able to do the right thing. After the last 2 years, who in this room trusts our legislature to act appropriately? So one of the reasons that I'm involved in the APP project is out of a desire for very deep constitutional reform in the province of Alberta, within Alberta. I'm a fifth-generation Albertan. My grandmother was delivered by a Cree midwife in 1896, not very far from Fort Saskatchewan. I have very deep ties to this province. And when I wake up and see what this province is being turned into through the misuse and misapplication of the Westminster parliamentary system, I'm literally sick to my stomach. What we're dealing with, and we've been dealing with it throughout in all of the litigation that we've been going through. I see my good friend and colleague, Mr. Gray's here, Leighton Gray's here. So thank you for coming, Leighton. Are two really disturbing words that are at the heart of all of the problems we're having, both with regard to that boil that we've just removed from the butt of Alberta politics, and with regard to Skippy Castro in Ottawa. And the two words that are so problematic are parliamentary privilege and parliamentary sovereignty. So there's this idea deeply rooted in the Westminster system of government that it's parliaments that are sovereign and they're sovereign over us. And there's this idea that somehow or other that we are subjects and we are the subjects of parliament. And at the end of the day, that it is parliament's will and it is parliament's privileges that take precedence over our individual rights, including our property rights. That has to change. From my perspective, the only way that that can happen is with fundamental reform, which can only come from Alberta following what I consider at this point to be the simplest path forward, which is for 50% plus one of us to vote on a clear question as being circulated on the petition by APP to leave Canada. Now, to be clear, I'm not a separatist. When I read Rob's work that the Freedom Strategy put together, and I think there's a lot of great ideas in there, but there's a reference in there that made me chuckle because they were referring to a lot of us as separatist cousins. Well, to be clear, I'm not a separatist. I'm an Albertan, right? And for any of you who are watching that disgusting display going on in Parliament, where person after person, including socialist members of Parliament from Edmonton, called our friends and neighbors every name in the book, racist, misogynist, ignorant, on and on and on, every name that they could come up with. Well, all of that was going on. It became really clear to me that Alberta doesn't need to separate from Canada. Canada has already separated from Alberta. And that's why, on a going forward basis, where there's a lot of great ideas that are coming out of the work of groups like, the Freedom Strategy that should be embraced. If we're talking about Bill 1 in the next election, Bill 1 should be the Alberta Referendum Act, to have a referendum on and just test the waters. I mean, Quebec's had several referendums. We don't need to have one, but let's find out once and for all how many of us are fed up enough to vote to leave Canada, right? Or really, to just acknowledge what in fact is is what I consider to be the fact now, which is that Canada has left us. So, what we need to do is to have that vote. And I look around this room, we're all adults, right? And I'm happy to see some children here today, but let's face it, right? We're allowed to make our own decisions, and we're allowed to express our own opinions. And I think the first thing that we should be able to do following the election of the next government is for that government to take the temperature of this province and find out how many of us are so fed up with the current status quo that they are prepared to vote to give effect to Canada separating from Alberta. Because God knows, after the last 2 years of living under a medical dictatorship in this province, we have all had enough. And again, from my perspective, that starts with reforming what's going on in Edmonton. Heaven forbid that we have a socialist government elected, in a true socialist government elected in Alberta, as opposed to the quasi-socialist government that we've been operating under for the last couple of years, where we have the premier deferring to dictator Hinshaw, then dictator Hinshaw saying in court, well, I'm not really the dictator. I'm being told what to do by dictator Kenny in the cabinet. With everybody pointing fingers at one another, trying to pretend that nobody's responsible for the misery that we've been going through. What we really need to do is to come up with as step 1, and I think in Rob's plan, it's step 5, the development of a constitution of the province of Alberta. What APP is committed to as step 1, along with the referendum, is developing an Alberta constitution. And from an APP perspective, that constitution is going to be Republican in nature. We are no longer going to have an elected dictatorship in Ottawa where we have a premier huddling over drinks on a rooftop with 5 of his closest friends, deciding on what they're going to do to us next, right? We're going to have a true constitution with an elected Senate, an elected legislature, a separately elected executive, and 30 years ago, if you'd asked me if I'd ever say this out loud, whether I would, as a young lawyer, whether I would have ever agreed with this, I'll tell you no. But I think it's time for an elected judiciary as well. Because clearly, and again, this is part of what Leighton and I have been battling in court, and I'm sure Rob's been battling in court as well with regard to issues in and around Section 1. Another board that I sit on is the board of Taking Back Our Freedoms with Brian Peckford. And of course, Brian Peckford's view, exactly, founding father of the Canadian Constitution Act 1982, Peckford's view, in my submission, is correct, that Section 1 was only meant to apply in times of the most dire national emergency. And I'm sorry, people who are already dying of 4 or 5 different things, getting a really bad cold bug, which is what a coronavirus is, and dying from that, along with the 4 or 5 other things that they're dying from, doesn't amount to a national emergency. It should not have empowered our governments to strip us of our liberties, lock us in our homes, tell us how many friends we're allowed to have at Christmas, or any of the other foolishness that we've been dealing with. So, in my view, we need to develop a system in Alberta, a system of governance that has far more checks and balances than the current system of government. Like no more, should we be seeing drone footage, obviously probably supplied by the NDP. Maybe it was Brian Jean, who knows? But seeing, the premier huddled with his 5 only friends in the province over bottles on top of the Sky Palace, figuring out what they're going to do to us next. Enough is enough. We need an actual system of government in this province that respects the rights of Albertans and citizens and provides sufficient checks and balances to all of us that we feel comfortable that we're not going to accidentally wake up one day in a province being run by a medical dictatorship, being fed talking points by the World Economic Forum. So for me, that's why I'm involved, and that's why I'm volunteering my time and taking time away from my adorable 11-year-old daughter on a Saturday, because this is important. I think this is important to all of our children's future. And the other thing that I want to keep, people to keep in mind, usually I get to follow Dennis, and Dennis does a really nice talk about, imagine us all in a canoe on the Niagara River, and we're heading to Niagara Falls. And there's one point in that trip where if we all get together and paddle as hard as we can and all work together, we can make it to shore before we all die, okay? That's how dire this is. And anybody who doubts that that's the circumstance that we're currently living under, keep in mind that Skippy and all of his minions are planning to shut down the oil industry in 8 years. 2030 is right around the corner. The other thing everybody needs to keep in mind, and there's so much odious legislation coming out of both Edmonton and Ottawa these days, it's hard to keep track of it all. But there's a Senate Bill S201, which is a companion bill to Senate Bill S230, which is the bill that's going to establish the universal basic income for Canada. Now, for those of you that are worried about your children's future, the universal basic income bill provides the genius provision that if you're 17 years old, you're not in school, you have no intention of going to school, you have no ambition to take any vocational training, go to university, get a job, do anything with your life, hey, it doesn't matter. You can stay home and Skippy's going to give you $2,000 a month. So think about that on a rolling forward basis. Now, also think about the companion bill, S201. S201, the plan there is to lower the voting age in Canada to the age of 16. So now, again, going back from prior to being a young lawyer, I hate to admit that if I were a 16-year-old and somebody told me that, hey, Jeff, if you vote for a Trudeau, next year when you turn 17, you can drop out of high school and the government's going to give you $2,000 a month to stay home, buy beer and muscle car parts. I hate to tell you how my 16-year-old self might have voted. We need to keep this in mind. And again, I'm making a bit of light of it because obviously on its face, all of this sounds so stupid as to be beyond belief, but this is actually these are Senate bills, right? And again, think about that. And again, Tanner does an excellent job talking about economics. Think about the economics of this country as every 17-year-old opts to stay home, drink beer and buy muscle car parts or whatever their hobbies happen to be, smoke pot and play Nintendo, as opposed to going to getting a job and bettering themselves for their future. We're not going to have a functioning economy within 5 or 10 years as we lose the lower end of our workforce to sheer stupidity, right? The other looming danger that we have is that we literally live in a country now where we are being governed by morons. And I mean this in a real sense. I was driving up to an APP rally not too long ago, and just for fun, because the day before I'd heard a liberal on CPAC in the House of Commons bragging about how it was that he was involved in coming up with the Western Canadian green energy plan. And he said, oh yeah. And he said, we've realized that there's nothing that we can't do with a barrel of canola oil that we can't do with a barrel of petroleum. And I'm going, okay, well, let's leaving aside the fact that, excuse my language, that's bullshit. But anyway, you know, plastics, petroleum products, all of the things that we make out of oil besides gas and diesel. So leave all of that aside. I just thought, okay, well, I'll ask Mr. Google, just out of morbid curiosity, what the spot price of a barrel of canola oil is today. On that day, it was $1,018, right? So we have geniuses in Ottawa who claim to be governing for the national good, who think that the national economy and combines that are, you know, producing food, tractors, you know, and pickup trucks that are, you know, running cattle and, you know, and moving feed and everything else, all the agricultural goods that are being moved around by gas and diesel, you know, at currently Putin prices, or I call it Biden prices of $117 a barrel, that, you know, that we can afford to do all of that on $1,000 a barrel canola oil. I mean, it's beyond belief that these are the people that are dictating to Alberta how it is that, you know, we are to live and how it is that we're to be governed. So again, you know, from my perspective, you know, when we talk about, and when you hear Dennis Modry talking about all of us needing to paddle together to get to shore, you know, the falls are upon us. And we all need to come together. We all need, as much as we can, you know, please, I'm thrilled to see so many people out here, you know, to support your local APP chapters. We're going to start getting volunteer committees together and getting things moving with regard to, you know, getting the petition out more broadly to the populace. Our goal is to get at least 300 signatures on that petition to take to the Alberta legislature, even prior to the 2023 election, to force a referendum to be called. In my view, it should be held at the same time as the 2023 election, because this should be the only election issue. So with that, I would like to thank you all for being here today. And thank you for understanding the urgency of this, because we wouldn't be here on a Saturday. We all get it. And thank you. Please share this with your friends and neighbors. And again, Rod, thank you for all the work that you've done. You're a true Albertan, and we appreciate it. And we appreciate your involvement. And in fact, Rod, I would like to invite you to talk to Leighton and I and join the Constitutional Drafting Committee, because I think that's the next step, is we need to get an Alberta Constitution drafted so that we can take a look at what this is going to look like on a going forward basis. So thank you all for coming. It really is an honor to be able to speak to you. Thank you. Yeah. That's really humbling and really kind. Thank you all very much.
Mr. Jeff Rath. Okay, so we're going to do something a little bit different now, but I just wanted to point out that our volunteers will be circulating throughout the room here with petition memberships if you'd like to buy one from your seat. So I'm going to invite all of the speakers up now. We're going to have kind of a little conversation with the moderator. So Hunter, if you can join us as well. And hopefully all the microphones work. I'll give you this one because you can't travel.
I cannot travel. See.
And I'll give you guys, you got one? And I'll give you one too.
That's true. It depends who you're looking for.
Guess we'll find out. We'll go closer to here. We get to stand nice and close to him. So that's
that's that. So for those that don't know me, my name is Hunter Hnidey, and there's two reasons why Tanner wanted me actually to moderate this. Number one is that I make him sound a lot smarter. That's usually the first reason why. But number two, I'm a bit more handsome. So that way you guys actually have some good to look at, I guess. We'll put it that way. Hey, that's yes. But with that, again, want to just say on behalf of the APP, we appreciate everyone coming out and excited for this discussion with these four very, very smarter gentlemen than I. So we'll kind of just go through, give people an option to speak if they would like, and we'll keep it nice and friendly. Right there, Mr. Rath, that'll be the, that's the, of course, hey? That's right. Okay, that goes for everyone though, of course, as well. So my first question would be, and these are from individuals in the audience and that we've heard across, is if a constitutional crisis happens, how or what would a resolution look like, and is there a timeline for that resolution?
Constitutional crisis.
Yeah, if it happens, how or what would that resolution look like, and what would be the timeline?
Well, if we're talking about the Alberta Sovereignty Act, what the Alberta Sovereignty Act does essentially is it's kind of the authority mechanism that allows the legislature to have a broad amount of solutions that they can employ. So if, for example, if the Supreme Court said if there was a constant, if we said we wouldn't enforce the carbon tax, and the government went to the Supreme Court and said, well, is that legal? And the Supreme Court would say, no, it's not legal, obviously, blah, 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 would side with the feds on it, say what they would say. Then what the legislature would do is they would gather and they would have a vote, and the vote would be on, notwithstanding the fact that the Supreme Court has said that the carbon tax must be enforced within the province of Alberta. The province of Alberta will, under authority of this act, will not enforce the carbon tax within the province of Alberta. And that would cause your constitutional crisis. Now, we got to, the key there though is the premier at that time has got to have real guts, right? Because they are going to get called every name in the book from Eastern Canada, the media traitor, this, that, the other thing, right? So we have to stand up at that point. We have to say, we don't care what you say, we don't care what names you throw, we're not enforcing these unconstitutional laws within our province anymore. If that was the question, I don't know.
Perfect, yeah, thank you. You want to?
Yeah, just to jump in on that. As far as I'm concerned, we are in a constitutional crisis right now. And the constitutional crisis was apparent when the Prime Minister of Canada went out of his way to completely inflame or attempt to inflame, because they wouldn't take the bait, a peaceful protest in Ottawa by calling everybody in Western Canada, and anybody who supported the Freedom Convoy, every name in the book, in the hopes of provoking riots on Parliament Hill to give him the cover he needed to invoke the Emergencies Act. As we know, they wouldn't take the bait, but of course, because all these people seem to work on whatever script they have, whether it makes any sense or not. The act was invoked, notwithstanding the fact there was no real emergency. And at the same time this was going on, we had a group of armed eco-terrorists destroying a construction camp in northeastern British Columbia, and the response from the government has been, the next day was to have Jagmeet Singh and numerous other Liberal members of Parliament stand up and say, oh, but don't worry, when we invoke the Emergencies Act, it won't apply to environmental activists. So we can literally have, and again, when I was a kid, I was a combat engineer, and I have lots of friends that are ex-military, including guys that were JTF2 operators. These guys are going, look, Jeff, JTF2 has a Hercules on standby to deal with attacks on critical infrastructure. We have a multi-billion-dollar, democratically and regulatorily approved pipeline that's being attacked by eco-terrorists, yet people with bouncy castles are the national emergency. We are in a constitutional crisis, and the only way that I see to get out of it is to pass the Referendum Act as quickly as possible and vote to get the hell out of this mess.
You want to speak? You're good on that. You guys good on that? Good. Perfect. Yeah, sounds good. One other question. I think that a lot of people have this question. It's a fair one. And that would be, what would tax collection look like? So I guess I'll give both options. If we were obviously to stay or to leave, would Alberta take over all taxes, some taxes? How would it look?
Well, I'll go. Tanner, you go first.
Oh, Alberta you'd have to take all of it. Now, again, it's the federal government. The simple answer is Alberta would have to control taxation. Then you'd make it much lower. This is why we're proposing this flat 10% tax. The taxes are nonsense how high they are. They're exorbitant. It's socialism, as far as I'm concerned, because it contemptibly removes your ability to generate the wealth that's required in order to exist with the highest level of well-being possible in order to satisfy some self-interested politicians in Ottawa. And so we agree quite plainly with the Free Alberta strategy, which is take control of that. This should be Alberta's jurisdiction.
Well said. I concur. We did take that over right away. Start an Alberta Revenue Agency immediately. Collect all provincial taxes, and Quebec right now is trying to also collect all federal taxes and then they remit the federal portion. Because right now, of course, they're trying to reverse it. Right? Exactly. Great idea. Why don't we do that here? Why don't we collect the provincial and the federal taxes, and then we'll remit to the feds the portion that they deserve? How about that? Which might not be as much as they hope.
That's always been my view on that, is that we should be collecting all of the taxes in Alberta, and then Alberta can decide what it's going to remit at the end of the day. And I hope nobody else missed the fact that so-called equalization was up for renegotiation on the 18th of April, and Jason Kenney did nothing. Or I'm sorry, on the 18th of April, 2019, and Jason Kenney did nothing.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. One more question that we've got here as well would be, if we're looking at Alberta's role within Canada and even out of Canada, what would our leverage look like? Like, why would Canada ever let us become independent? Why would the court side with us here?
That's right up your wheelhouse.
Well, like with the Supreme Court, the secession reference decision of 1998, like that's Canada's constitutional law. That's not a decision that the Prime Minister gets to make for himself. I mean, the Parliament filled in kind of some of the details of the secession reference case with what's called the Clarity Act. There are many scholars, especially in Quebec, who say that the Clarity Act is more rigid and more strict than what the secession reference case allows for. The secession reference case itself mentions that if the federal government tries to, like after, let's say a province passes a successful independence referendum with clear majority, clear question, if the federal government tries to prevent, like negotiates in bad faith as a way of preventing the province from getting out, the province would, like it doesn't suggest that the province should declare unilateral independence, but it suggests that that might be what the province would do next. Like if the government does not negotiate in good faith with the province, it's actually violating the constitutional law, and the province, in a sense, then would have some kind of justifiability in moving beyond that. So like the key thing, and I want to emphasize this, the important thing is the democratic will of Albertans. If we pass a clear, like we've got a clear majority on a clear independence question, that is the key thing. And what Ottawa does ultimately, I mean, they might try and stop with certain obstacles and stuff, but what really matters is what Albertans want, and we will be the ones who decide, because we will have supporters, in other parts of the country, in other parts of the world. I mean, the Americans, if they see that we really want out, they're not going to support Ottawa against us, right? Because they won't go against the majority. Well, I mean, it's unlikely. I mean, we don't know, we can't say anything 100% with certainty for the future, right? But we can only go forward with what we know. And what we do know is the constitutional law allows us to become independent under these conditions of the clear question and the clear majority. That's what we know, and that's what we have to move forward with. And we can't, allow potential things in the future that might block us. We can't let those things stop us from moving forward with what we do know. We do know what the path is. We've got to follow that path, and we have to deal with these unknowable things in the future. We can't let, I know people bring up to me, what about this? What if the government does this? And what if the government does that? Well, we can't know that. All we can know is what we have now, and we move forward with what we know now and not get tangled up with what this might happen, what that might happen. Let's just move forward with what we know, because that's what we do know and what we can do now.
And something that I wanted to add, and that's why the Alberta referendum petition project is so near and dear to my heart. When you read that petition, it's a petition for that form of question to be put to the citizens of Alberta. The question was drafted with the secession reference in mind. It was drafted with the Clarity Act in mind, but it also makes it clear that Alberta is going to be leaving Canada free of any debt to Canada. And again, both Rob and Tanner touched on this earlier, and I believe Michael may have as well. But, a number of years ago, I did a fairly large case on behalf of a First Nation in northeastern BC who were cheated out of approximately $10 million in the late 70s by the federal government. And of course, by the time we'd done working with our actuaries and had run the math on, what the interest rates were, especially going through those ultra high interest rates of the 80s, that $10 million rapidly turned into 148, right? So when everybody hears that number, and we've talked about opportunity costs and the rest of it, I can tell you just on a pure actuarial basis, using Bank of Canada interest rates, that if you were to apply that exercise to that $600 billion, that $600 billion that we put into Canada, right, would actually be a number something closer to 6 or 7 trillion that Canada owes us. So, as far as I'm concerned, it's really clear that everybody needs to understand all of the stupidity that Trudeau's been engaged in the last 2 years, putting $600 billion into CERB payments, as opposed to putting the goddamn money into our hospitals where it was needed, right? So, we're not going to be paying any of that money when we leave. And that's my view on the matter. And I just wanted to make that clear.
Awesome. Yeah. And this one we're going to ask to both. Obviously, we've got Alberta Prosperity Project and Free Alberta Strategy representatives here. So first, I'll start with you there, Rob. How long would it look like to stay within Canada before you guys would move to Plan B? Like, would there be a point where we go, maybe this isn't working now, let's try the referendum, or is that not in the picture?
No, you have to, anybody who's been involved in any form of negotiation knows full well that you have to have a viable walk-away strategy, or else you'll never get anywhere in a negotiation. So you can't, like this idea that, you see premiers constantly saying over and over again, oh, well, we would never hold a vote on separation. That's insanity. You've given away your entire bargaining position at that point. They're just going to keep laughing at you. So no, the Free Alberta strategy, the idea is, look, these are things we can do right now. Get the ball, we'll take our sovereignty back, make Alberta essentially sovereign jurisdiction within Canada. But look, the feds, how they respond, that's the great wild card. They might respond well. You never know. You get a good government. Maybe Pierre's in there. Maybe somebody else is in there. Who knows? Maybe they say, you know what? We're going to renegotiate this. We're going to give more power to the provinces. We got to fix this, or we're going to lose this country. They might, or they might not. There could be Justin Trudeau or Jagmeet Singh, or who knows who else, Stephen Guilbeault. And if that's the case, and we've done everything we can, and and still that's not enough, and still they impose economic sanctions against us, which is what they've done. Then at that point, absolutely, you got to have the referendum question, in my view.
But just to be clear, and this will be of no surprise to you, as far as I'm concerned, Plan B is a morning after pill, and the time is now.
Wait, I'm gonna ask one question though, Jeff, here, because I'm gonna challenge him a little bit on that. What in the hell have we done over the last 40 years? We have not done anything to assert our sovereignty within Canada. Nothing. So shouldn't we start there and then see what happens?
You were the one that was in the legislature. What the hell's the UCP in the Alberta legislature?
Great. Hey, I don't disagree. I'm not blaming you for the inaction. That's for sure. I'm saying that if we get a chance we got to start somewhere. We can't just, a lot of these plans that we've talked about today that I've heard, they're fantastic, but these are 10 to 15, 20-year projects. Let me explain that. Right now, if you hold that referendum question in the province of Alberta, tell me what you think it'll be. What would be the question to secede? Like, what would be the percentage that say yes to that? 80%. You think it would be 80%? What if I told you that every poll I've ever seen on that would likely put it at about 25%?
Well, let's have a campaign and find out. That's my point.
Yeah.
And again,
but if you do that,
but just let me
sure.
give you my 2 cents on it. I mean, again, we're all adults here. Why can't we have a say in how this province is being run? If everybody is so confident that it's only 30% support, let's have a public campaign where this is the only issue that's being debated, and have a true poll from every community in this province as to how they feel about it. Because I'll tell you what, if we had a referendum tomorrow and we ran 2 referendum questions at the same time, one, the question that APP is supporting, we leave Canada debt free, and 2, that the new Alberta government will commit itself to balanced budgets and a flat 10% tax, and have both referendums at the same time, I think the answer would be closer to 60 or 70%.
Perfect. Thank you for that.
That's fair. That's fair. I mean, I just worry that if we get, let's say we do it and we only get 25 to 30, if we walk before we run before we walk, so to speak, and we only get 25 to 30%, do we set our entire movement back a generation by doing that? That's my worry. I want to make sure we win this.
Quebec has been doing nothing but picking our pockets clean by threatening like a little baby to leave Confederation every time they want more money from the rest of us.
That's fair.
So I don't think there's anything wrong with polling Albertans on the issue.
Oh, that's fair point, Jeff.
And this is also why we're advocating, while we discuss this 3.5% strategy by Erica Chenoweth, which is if you 3.5% of a relevant population will dictate sorry about the feedback, will dictate the way that the society moves. And so when you look at that FAQ section on the Alberta Prosperity Project's website, and when you look at that title, which states, what is the timeline to get control of our destiny? You hold an election in 2023. Well, no, you don't. We have to have one. We have one in 2023. But the Alberta Prosperity Project and other educational projects aren't going away. We'll continue to educate as many Albertans as possible on these benefits and merits of independence, because it's quite correct. If we hold a referendum and, knowing that we're going to get 20%, well, that won't work at all. We have to be guaranteed and know that we're going to receive this solid, absolute, clear majority, so that the rest of Canada recognizes exactly what we're doing. And so the membership numbers with the APP are a large part of that metric. There are other polling metrics, of course, that can be employed. And I suppose to conclude, it means that it is up to us as Albertans to push this thing forward. If all of us work as hard as we can and tell as many individuals as we can about the benefits and merits of independence, then that referendum can be held sooner rather than later.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah. And a couple more questions here, and then we will be finished up and let you guys be getting out soon. Question maybe, obviously this is a bit more of an APP question, but has there been consultation with First Nations people about the referendum? And if so, how do we execute with federal First Nation treaties? How would we work around that?
That's actually one of the things that I'm the proudest of, is that we've recruited Chief Lawrence Courteray to the board of directors of APP. And Lawrence and I have consulted with the Aboriginal community or the Indigenous community in Alberta, and have come up with a very comprehensive Indigenous sovereignty plan to make sure that Indigenous nations of Alberta are full partners in Alberta sovereignty. And the program that Lawrence and I have developed in consultation with our friends and colleagues in the Indigenous community, I can guarantee you, once we start rolling that out across the province, and once the Indigenous nations of Alberta truly understand the benefits of what we're proposing, that we'll have over 90% support. Because let's keep in mind what's been going on here with the Indigenous community. Well, Trudeau was flying in his private jet over Kamloops last year on National Aboriginal Day to go surfing with his buddies in Tofino. People in this province, in Northern Alberta, still don't have clean drinking water. So let's keep that in mind, how well the Liberals have treated the Indigenous people of this country. And certainly, and again, if Dennis was here, he usually does lays all the foundational things that Tanner and I miss. But one of the issues, do people in this room know that we send $60 billion a year to Ottawa and we only get $27 billion back? So there's $33 billion a year that are leaving this province and not coming back, because all the money is going to pay for subsidized daycare in Quebec and not in Alberta. So certainly out of that $33 billion, we can afford to come up with a meaningful resource revenue sharing program with Alberta Indigenous nations that would lift them out of poverty, right? and still afford a flat 10% tax rate across the board in this province because of the wealth that we can generate when we work together as hardworking, industrious Albertans.
Did you want to touch on that as well, First Nations, or no? You're good? Sounds good. Perfect. Next question here that we've got is being landlocked a concern at all for Alberta if we do the Sovereignty Act or become independent? Is that ever going to be a concern for us?
That's a good question. With regards to independence, is landlocking a concern? Well, I would begin by answering that geographically it's true. If you take the definition, we're landlocked, but really Alberta is policy locked, much more than landlocking. I mean this, of course, insofar as we, for example, can't get a pipeline built. We can't build the meaningful capacity that we require in order to ship our oil specifically to where it needs to go. But let's talk about the problem of landlocking. So firstly, it's a common misconception that the vast majority of our trade is executed with nations across the oceans. It's not. The vast majority of our trade, and COVID has skewed the numbers a little bit, but let's take it in 2019, 2020, before all of this nonsense occurred. 90+% of Alberta's trade is engaged with America, with our friends to the south. And of course, we trade with provincial borders as well. The same is true of oil. Canada exports 3.8 million barrels of oil per day. But that does not go to Europe immediately. That does not go to Asia. The vast majority of that oil, 98%, heads south of the border to America. Now, Canada has the third largest oil reserves in the world. Massive, huge. 98+% of those reserves are located in the oil sands in Alberta. So, if Alberta became independent, Canada's ranking in the world when it comes to the surplus of proven oil would fall from third down to about 22nd, 23rd. And of course, Alberta would take that third spot. Just Alberta alone right now is fourth, right? Because Canada's third, but if you take away that, then we become fourth. So we have a vast, vast ocean of oil. But then this speaks also to the idea of leverage, insofar as what happens to our oil? Well, it goes south, but it also goes throughout Canada. So we have Trans Mountain, which starts in central Alberta, and then it heads up to or through to BC, to Burnaby, to be refined for Vancouver for their jet fuel at the airport. And then, of course, we also have a pipeline that goes east, goes to Toronto, goes to Ontario, even goes to Montreal, to believe it or not, to two massive refineries to be used there. But then, as I said, it goes south. It heads to America. There are monstrous refineries in America, huge ones in the Midwest and in other locations. The reason I said other locations is because there's really one spot where we want to go. We want to get our oil to the Gulf Coast, down in the far, far south. The reason for that is because the Gulf Coast is the largest refinery, and it hosts the largest refineries for heavy sour oil or heavy oil in the world. And that's what we predominantly have here in Alberta. Our oil is heavy. And so if we can ship it, or if we could ship it down to the Gulf where it could be, and if we could do it efficiently, well, then of course our oil would have much more marketability and we'd receive higher prices, more proper prices. So if you became independent, you would have control of that, so to say, right? You would have, for the first time, proper Alberta negotiators negotiating with America for access. We could build a pipeline straight south, right down if you wanted to. You say, but what about America? The question is valid. Of course, we can't control what American presidents do. But again, what was the first thing that Mr. Trudeau did after Keystone XL was canceled? The first thing he did was he appointed Stephen Guilbeault, who's this noted anti-pipeline activist, to minister for the environment and climate change. And so you see, Mr. Trudeau says one thing, we support Alberta's oil, but he speaks another. And as Jeff already mentioned, 2030 comes the execution of our oil industry. I might also mention one more thing. In America, of course, they use a lot of oil. It's a large country. Canada is the #1 exporter of oil to America. It's critical, it's important. The second largest exporter of oil to America is Mexico. Now, they export about some 800,000 barrels of oil per day, and that goes to the Gulf Coast. It's almost the same oil, it's heavy as well. But next year, it's just been announced that Mexico is totally shutting in which means that not one drop of oil will be exported from Mexico to America, meaning there is going to be an 800,000 barrel of oil per day shortage or discrepancy in America that's going to need to be filled. And here we are in Alberta with so much oil that's just ready to go. It's right there. If only we could build a pipeline. So it's this idea of leverage. You see now, one more quickly, I know this is long, I'm sorry, but one more thing. What about grain and so on? Fair enough, because grain does go overseas. As again, you know, we produce a lot of it along with Saskatchewan, and other commodities are shipped to ports, and then they cross the oceans, along with being traded within Canada, et cetera, et cetera. What about that? What if Canada, after Alberta gained its independence, was playing hardball and became grumpy and upset that we were independent? Well, let's look at the Vancouver port. One of the largest in the continent. It's huge. It's a phenomenal size. Automobiles, goods, computers, grain, massive grain terminals are located there. It's a huge port. And Eastern Canada, along with Western Canada, relies on it for the trade of goods, particularly, you know, automobiles and meats and all of these things. If we became independent and Canada was upset about it, you could so easily say, fine, if you wish to play hardball, not only could we turn off the taps, which is a credible threat, because of course we have the capacity to self-sustain, we could also put a tariff on every single good that is shipped to or from the Vancouver port from the east. And if that still wasn't enough to get Ottawa's attention, we could say not one single good is going to come through Alberta until you give us access to that Vancouver port. So, but I might say quickly, I do not see any reason whatsoever for Canada and Alberta to be at odds about this. You know, we're neighbors. We intend to be friends. We're not enemies. And the same is true with America. There are UN charters and so on that allow access for landlocked nations to the sea. And trading is mutually beneficial. Otherwise, individuals wouldn't engage in it. The same is true with Canada and Alberta. So why not trade? I'm so excited about the future that this would bring, because you would have leverage, you'd have proper negotiation, and I think our trade and our relations with other nations would be better than they have ever been.
And then on an added note, think about what we could do in Alberta with an extra $10 or $15 billion a year to put into private-public partnerships to drastically increase our own refining capacity in Alberta, so that we could actually be, actually refining our own oil here in Alberta and shipping out gasoline and diesel instead.
Perfect. All right. And this is one final question before I'll get Shannon to come up and close. And it is in regard to the World Economic Forum. For those that haven't heard episode 3 of the podcast, Alberta Prosperity Project, check it out. We do talk about that. Had to give that little plug. I had to. Yeah.
I was going to say a quick thing. So Hunter's like the Johnny Carson of the podcast. Hey, it's great. It's a lot of fun. But this is just something so we were talking about the youth and how important it is to get the youth involved in this movement, and any movement for that matter, with regards to asserting our sovereignty. You have to engage them perhaps in different means than what is otherwise classic and the status quo, because it's a different generation. So I want to let you know about the numbers of this podcast, because they're so encouraging. We've started the podcast 3 weeks ago. We've done 3 episodes, 1 episode per week. The average age has been between 27 to 29. So a fantastic age when we're talking about, political discussions and so on. But the viewership is the listening-ship has been what's most encouraging. We started with 4,000 listeners on the first podcast. Then we went to 6,000 on the next podcast. On this third one, we've already surpassed 10,000 listeners. So exciting. That was just a quick plug. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for that. It is super exciting to see, and it's cool. The app lets me see where everyone listens, and just the average age. It's very, very cool. The Alberta Prosperity Project podcast. Yep, you betcha.
And we're for sure going to have the gentleman on very soon. It'd be great to have guests, and it's exciting, very exciting.
Absolutely. Yes. So, like I said, final question here, and this is in regards to the World Economic Forum's agenda to restructure the free and democratic spirit of Alberta that we have. What exactly are your thoughts on how we would stop the World Economic Forum, I guess, from coming to Alberta for everyone? There we go. We'll figure out how to get that.
Oh boy. So I absolutely agree with, I forget who was talked about earlier, that one of the greatest threats to our sovereignty and to our way of life right now is ceding authority over our healthcare system to the World Health Organization or the World Economic Forum. They are absolutely the enemy, and we got to just call them that. And to our friends, neighbors, people have to understand that their goal is to take our resources. It is to control us without having any democratic recourse to do anything about it. They're dangerous. And so that's why I think one of the first uses of the Alberta Sovereignty Act or the Constitution or anything that's done has to be an indication that notwithstanding any national or international law that purports to control our healthcare system and regulations, that within the boundaries of Alberta, we will not recognize those treaties. We will not recognize any of those policies. We will run our own healthcare system, period.
It's no coincidence at all that in July of 2020, as our lives were turning into a living hell in this province, that Alberta Health Services proudly announced its partnership with the World Economic Forum. And I think, everybody in this room, I think all of us need to pay attention to this. All of the corporations that are partnered with the WEF, to the extent that we can boycott them, we should, be it TELUS, BHP, whatever it is, that's our future if we don't wake up. I mean, the very definition of fascism is Klaus Schwab's vision as to how the group in Davos is going to run the rest of the world and our lives going into the future. And for people that don't get that, they obviously didn't do much reading in and around World War II.
You might just one quick thing. I would totally agree with what's been said. They're dead on the mark. As far as I can tell, this is one of the reasons why we're advocating, not as far as I can tell, this is one of the reasons why we're advocating so strongly for a republic. And the reason is because in a republic, it's a rule by objective law. You see, what I've been able to observe and what it seems to me is that those men and women in Davos and the WEF and the WHO, they believe they are the law. They're not ruled by law. They become the law. But you see, it's in the law that we discover how to act human, right? When the law says thou shalt not steal and the Constitution says you will not steal, it tells you how to act in civilization as beings that are higher than those that are within the animal kingdom. And so it's not even so much that those WEF members are bad men. They are bad men, but rather they're not men at all anymore. They've stepped outside of the bounds of humanity. And so, and as you know, this is bad. It's objectively evil. It's objectively wrong. So this is why it's so critical, as Rob has mentioned, as Jeff has mentioned, to completely and absolutely declare our absolute opposition to such organizations.
Perfect. Well, just as I call Shannon up, what do we say we give these people actually a standing ovation? That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you.
Now I got a whole bunch of microphones, and I don't know what to do. That's good. Thank you. Okay, so just before y'all rush out the door, remember at the beginning I mentioned Thomas Jefferson. Whenever you do a thing, act as the world is watching. The world is watching Alberta right now. Alberta Prosperity Project is about planting the seeds of hope. We've seen both provincial and federal governments do their best to divide and conquer us, making us feel alone. It is our hope that you realize that today. You are not alone. Alone, we can only do so little, but united together, we can do so much. We cannot heal in isolation, but we can in community. Alberta Prosperity Project wants to help you rebuild your community and the community of Alberta. There is no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares for. No greater sense of purpose than growing fellowship, building community, and forging unity. Come join the movement. Create a fabulous tomorrow with the free and prosperous nation of Alberta. We've got one chance to secure a future for our children and our grandchildren. We've got one chance to gain our freedom and our prosperity. And that is by electing an independence-focused government in 2023. We need people with vision. We need people with ideas and energy. So please, buy your memberships, become chapter leaders, become volunteers, create events in your communities that bring people together. We need to show our friends and our neighbors that there is hope, the hope that we planted the seeds of right here today. We need you to be the change you want to see in this world. Talk to your friends and your neighbors. Encourage them to attend an APP event themselves. Turn that "you'll never do this" into "this is 100% doable." We have a vision for our community of Alberta. We're building a community within ourselves, and we want all of you to join us. Our message is strong, our community is growing, and our solution, with no politicians at our table, is to unite 500,000, a million and a half Albertans. That's something that's never been done before. We're making history right now. I challenge you to be on the right side of that history. We must restore our communities owing our ultimate, the dog wants to too. We must restore our communities owing our ultimate allegiance not to any government, but to our fellow man. Alberta will become a sovereign constitutional republic, one where the First Nations people sit at the table as partners in the creation of the new nation of Alberta. And on that great day, Alberta truly will become united, strong, and free. Thank you for coming.